I wanted to start off by saying that I do not take, I feel extremely privileged today to be introducing this book. And I wanted to start off by reading what Akash Leena Basu, reviewing the book for the Anthropology Book Forum, writes. And this is the only review of Omer's book which is, only 3 months old that's come out. And, he's getting a lot of very interesting reviews, but she starts off by saying, uncommonly beautiful and mortally dangerous is how Azad Kashmir comes alive in and through Aijazi's pen of immense might. He thinks collaboratively and across traditions, weaving an intellectual assemblage, shattering the normative epistemes, conditioning on Kashmir studies, replete with various kinds of scholastic drifts between various kinds of belongings and non-belongings. This book embodies a creative contradiction. The contradiction is both of life and antidisciplinarity. Commanding a wide breadth of scholarship, Aijazi shows that his interlocutors attempt to live despite the world. They refuse to accept the norm and forge a life in and of contradiction. I want to start off by saying that it's been a long time that an ethnography made me cry. And there were moments while I was reading this book that I actually teared up. And I think the last time I cried when I read a fiction, which was called M and the Big Home by Jerry Pinto, who is from my little state that I come from in India. But I think for me, the book moved me at many levels. The poetic writing, the systematic rejection of frames, of knowledge production that we internalize uncritically, and the integrity with which Omer embraces the Pahars and its people with heart and feeling that produces an ethnography that is both creative and emancipatory. And the form of the book is unique, where the ethnography is divided into scenes which are rich and textured, and each scene warrants an independent reading for the work it does to critical disaster studies, but also to the idea of repair and flourishing, a frame that I'm hoping Omer elaborates on in his talk. The idea takes many forms and is riddled with contradictions, which are breathtakingly real and foregrounded in atmospheric moorings and the struggle of everyday life. The biggest strength of the book, and this is my reading of it, is its emancipatory potential. And this potential runs in 3 realms. First, in methodology, where care, feeling, and slowness have been brought to the heart work and heartache of conscious ethical wounding that centers accountability to communities and bodies that we extract knowledge from. So I think methodologically, it's extremely strong in what it is doing. Empirically, each of the scenes, and the book has 5 scenes, unravels, sorry, it's not going down. Just a sec. So empirically, each of these scenes unravels an alternate ontology or modality of life, either through kindness, minor anger, through friendship with God, or through imagining different futures. Each of these makes space for what Omer calls for a grammar of life to emerge. This opens endless possibilities for a reading of life that forges ahead in the face of violence, disasters, and the challenges posed by the complex topography that he's negotiating. Theoretically, I feel, bridging this ethnographic work with readings from Black studies, Indigenous studies, and affect theory, it opens ways to reimagine the discipline and sometimes even refusing disciplines and institutions that are caught in colonialist frames of knowledge production. This opens other forms of engagement through activism and solidarity that decenter these frames. Each step is meticulously backed by research and writing that constantly brings the margins and as spaces of creative imagination to the center of writing and analysis. And this happens quite seamlessly through the book. And I think that is the real beauty of the book. The emancipatory potential in these 3 realms for me is the biggest strength of the book. I want to point, and I know like we have to do, I want to point to one danger and probably one potential contribution that remains hidden in the amazing things that the book does. And I think, and the danger is not what you are doing, but the danger is of the larger academic world in which we operate. Yeah. And the thing that I want to say there is in rejecting the colonial categories of extraction, do we risk the risk the danger of creating new ones? Yeah, and that's one question that I have. And can human experience be completely decategorized? And what is the work that we constantly need to put in to remind people of the kind of work that you do in atmospheric violence? The second thing that I see quite organically emerging through Omer's book, and something that I'm hoping will potentially be developed in further writing that you do, is how beautifully the pahads, the mountains, emerged as an analytical category. And that is something that will be of huge contribution in critical disaster studies, but also human geography. I think I'm going to shut up here and we will let Omer speak for 40 minutes and then we'll take questions and answers. Thank you.
I have to match that now. Well, thank you so much, Rubina, for your thoughtful and careful reflections. I'm in awe that you have such an intense response to the book. And I hope these were tears of freedom more than anything else. And I hope that anyone, who chooses to read the book will be able to see a bit of themselves in the writing, especially if you're someone who's been pushed out of the institution or pushed out of the discipline for being too excessive, too political, too engaged, for having too much feeling. So hi everyone, it's a real honor to be in the company of friends, colleagues, students, in the company of other racialized scholars, and in the company of so many mission-driven researchers, students, and activists. I should remind you that we are in the belly of the beast. We are in the imperial core, and we're at the heart of the military-industrial academic complex. So right now, our students are taking, extraordinary risk in lobbying the University of Manchester to cut ties with unethical companies that profit from war and genocide, and break research partnerships that enable settler colonialism and military occupation in Palestine and beyond. So really, our students are holding us accountable. And it is that very same sense of accountability that compelled me to write this book. I wrote this book to consider knowledge as emancipation, to consider academic practice as a way to open up the world, not contain it, to welcome back life's excessiveness, brilliance, and exuberance into our writing, thinking, and theorizing. So how do we work with stories that don't fit, or stories that don't correspond to the way we imagine and organize the world? And what if non-normativity is taken as the only stable sensibility and knowledge becomes a project of feeling from such a location? So for me, the book has meant, refusing academic and disciplinary conventions that we feel so pressured to uphold, and that have become so ingratiated in our scholarly identities. So that writing is not reduced to its instrumentality, and concepts are imagined as forms of care, as forms of repair, and as kinship. So the last academic year has been absolutely bonkers, with race riots happening in Manchester over the summer, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and the kind of institutional aggression, many of us continue to face for activism in the academy. And I think it's fair to say that all of us are pretty exhausted, right? And I think it was Deleuze who said that exhaustion is a fundamental to creating new subjects. It is only once all possibilities have been exhausted that something genuinely new can come about. So perhaps a creative life, whether of refusal or resistance, can only come about through exhaustion. So I like to think of myself, as a decolonial scholar trained in both the social sciences and humanities. And the discipline where I usually become the most legible is anthropology. And that's how I've sought citizenship in the university. So some days like today, I'm an anthropologist, but hopefully not a capital A anthropologist. And by capital A anthropology, I mean an anthropology which doesn't get in the way of imperial knowledge production and which doesn't interrupt colonial violence. And I think if not careful, every anthropologist faces the danger of becoming a capital A anthropologist. And one can say the same for any disciplinary orientation one may be attached to. So the book takes ambition from what Deborah Thomas and Kamari Clark call radical humanism, kind of an invitation to move beyond anthropology's positivist past and present, which in its quest for meaning often reduces people to knowable subjects or data points and objects of analysis. In many ways, this book is about keeping that power in check, keeping the expert academics' power in check, who for far too long has decided, who is human or who is worthy of being human. And maybe it's not sufficient to simply keep that power in check. Perhaps it's time to take it entirely away. A little about myself. I think that transparency is important given the context of the book. So I was born and raised in Pakistan in the capital city. My grandparents from both sides left India during partition, leaving everything behind. And the struggles of beginning anew in a context of loss, nostalgia, and emerging national pride from the backdrop of my bringing in a middle-class Muslim household. So growing up, my parents, pictured here, presented to me radically opposing modes of being in the world. My dad rose ranks as a technocrat and retired as a devotee to the Pakistani state. He worked as a physicist and he worked in the manufacturing of weapons of war. My mom is a community worker who relies on gut, grit, intuition. And she runs a very modest women's support network in the city's so-called informal settlements. So my parents, embody very different notions of what it means to devote yourself to people and place. My dad is regarded as an expert. He's a scientist, a true Pakistani patriot. He has a list of awards and medals to prove it. And my mom is simply known as Baji, which in Urdu means elder sister, on account of her close friendships with the women that she works with. So I have to constantly ask myself that how do I best devote myself to the communities whom I work with and the places that they live from my location, in the military, industrial, academic complex. And this question is important because it holds me in a state of productive tension and forces me to think more carefully about both the content and form of my scholarship. And to be honest, I don't necessarily want to hide behind the certitude and confidence of academic expertise. I'm also drawn to other kinds of investments and energies one can also bring to their praxis. And if you think about expertise, it's such a strange word. How can anyone even claim expertise in the lives of other people? So while I was, publishing this book and dealing with university presses, with peer review reports, and the many times I've presented chapters at various conferences, I've realized that this book is perhaps not for everyone. Which, is not what I should be saying. I should be saying for everyone, buy the book, read it, right? But I think it's not. I think the book demands a certain kind of reader, a very capacious reader, someone who's enthralled and possessed. That's because I demand a lot from the reader. And I don't seek to sustain a singular narrative. My arguments are kaleidoscopic and elliptical. And I try to weave, texture, color, pattern. And my offerings are burdensome because I don't provide instructions for landing or guidance on how the book should be read. And I think those who seek comfort in inherited knowledge or tradition will find the text quite frustrating. And that's quite intentional. That's because the lives of others should not be so easily consumable. Otherwise, reading risks becoming just another rote, automatic, and colonial mode of conquest. So I wrote this book with the explicit intention of favoring ethical relation over disciplinary certitude, to very purposefully reject canonical knowledge, and to choose and prioritize world building over discipline building, and to kind of reset the labels of creative, decolonial, experimental as default orientations, not as atypical approaches, and to consider how knowledge production can be a form of attunement rather than capture. If you're going to ask me, how does this word contribute to the literature? What knowledge gap does it fill? My response will be, who cares? There's so much more at stake here. And I find that question, rather distracting and even unimportant. I do think we need to find a far better reason for doing our work than just some overdetermined vision of incremental knowledge production, particularly if it's going to be something as invasive as ethnography, and that too of colonized peoples and colonized places, because the stakes are so much higher. So the book, or at least I hope so, also gives us an opportunity to renegotiate our expectations from scholarly text. It is entirely possible to create our own ethos of adjudication. So what are the standards that we want to be held against, which can be different from the standards set in our fields or disciplines? And when I say we, I'm not referring to the liberal we, because there is no universal consensus amongst us. But my invocation of we is rather a call for community. It's an invitation to hold anthropology and academia accountable for its legacies of harm towards Black, brown, queer, and indigenous bodies. So, in that spirit, and with these aspirations in mind, let me get more into the book itself. So the book is set in the disputed territory of Kashmir. As some of you may know, Kashmir is a former princely state, presently caught between the state-seeking nationalisms of Pakistan and India. Some parts of it also lie within China. And I work near the line of control, that is the de facto border that splinters the region of Kashmir into Pakistan and Indian-held areas. And my work takes place in the portion of Kashmir that is under Pakistan jurisdiction, and its extension outward into northern and northwestern Pakistan. The line of control is heavily militarized, so much so that it's said to be visible from outer space. The region is home to the Pahari people, roughly people of the mountains, who speak the Pahari language and its many cognate forms. And these are semi-nomadic pastoral communities. So regardless of how they are separated by Pakistan's internal borders, the Pahari people are connected through a shared language, shared land-based lifestyles, migratory practices, and other forms of ecological knowledges and consciousness that stem from making life hospitable in the mountains as opposed to merely being Pakistani or Kashmiri. So in many ways, being Pahari, being off the mountains, exceeds the containments of the nation state. This is, the kind of map one often expects to see when you talk about Kashmir as a fixed geolocation. Because for the most part, Kashmir is imagined as a fragment of South Asia, needing to be tamed and disciplined and domesticated in line with visions of post-colonial state formation. And for those of you who work in South Asia, you know that South Asia, and by extension, South Asian studies, is primarily viewed through the lens of India, which is considered to be the intellectual, political, cultural heartbeat of the region, and constitutes a hegemonic frame of reference. This means that the nation state, often takes the front stage in most contemporary conversations on Kashmir, rendering Kashmiri life subservient to a rather Indian-centric history, denying the Kashmiri people, the multiple political, ethical, and historical imaginations that situate them outside a framework of containment. But there are other kinds of maps that are also possible. This is a sculpture from a New Delhi-based Indian artist, Subodh Gupta, titled Line of Control. It mimics a mushroom cloud resembling that of after a nuclear explosion, referring to the fact that both Pakistan and India are nuclear armed states. This is another map. This piece is also titled Line of Control, by Pakistani visual artist Farida Batul, who suggests an even more sensuous embrace of the line of control. This in a video playing in the background shows Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control waving and acknowledging each other, since they aren't allowed to actually cross over and embrace their relatives and friends. And it's quite evident that the richness of people's lives far exceed the logics of geopolitics. Catherine McKettrick describes the earth as skin, and she believes that philosophical attention is not only needed on present cartographic rules because they unjustly reify human hierarchies in place, but because these rules are alterable, and there exists a terrain through which different stories can be told. And arguably, Kashmir's colonial present is as much a result of a historical process as it is of a permanent denial for it to become a different kind of political space. But as McKettrick reminds us, cartographic rules are indeed contestable, and different seizures of geography are possible, where, for example, Kashmiri bodies move freely, unencumbered by military checkposts, barbed wire, and borderlands. Once while attending a debating competition, a Kashmiri school teacher, he said to me that he wants his students to come together in Kashmir outside of India's imperial claws, Pakistan's overbearing bureaucracy, and China's giant stature, right? So then, what are the different stories that can be told about Kashmir and the people who live there? And how can one think of Kashmir as a political and philosophical project and as an element of South Asia outside the framework of containment? And I think this is a serious challenge to an area studies model that draws on fixed and territorial notions of the nation state. But there are other forms of distributed and fractured sovereignties which also need centering. So in this book, I try to locate Kashmir outside of its contemporary placement, both geographically and epistemologically. And I do this in two ways. First, by investing in the Kashmir of the Pahars, that is the Kashmir of the mountains, and thinking about Kashmir through the lens of the Pahari people. And by establishing the mountains as the center, not the periphery. Because most writings on Kashmir focus on the Kashmir Valley, and not the surrounding mountainscapes, which are seen as empty, desolate, and cut off from Kashmir's intellectual and social pulse. And second, by refusing Kashmir's placement within the cultural imaginations of South Asia. One reviewer of the book, when it was under consideration at a much different press, and they had a very strong reaction to the writing, demanding that the manuscript should be brought closer to home, in systematic relation to South Asian intellectual traditions, before the book could be taken seriously. But the problem is South Asia has never been a home for Kashmir. And noting the way Kashmir gets typecast within South Asian studies literature, I've searched quite intentionally for epistemic communities outside of South Asia altogether, such as within Indigenous scholarship and Black studies, or some other, mode of knowing rooted in different histories of exclusion. Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Leanne Simpson remind us that Black and Indigenous intellectual formations already come after the end of the world. And a weaving of Indigenous and Black epistemology for Kashmir is generative, not simply because people in each location suffer as they do, but because they refuse the conditions of death being imposed upon them. And in the convergence and disjunctures that arise, there's hope for new and creative lines of inquiry for Kashmir. And our underlying intention is to dislodge Kashmir from being only a geopolitical problem, but only a geopolitical solution, as frequently referred to by security analysts and control theorists who are unwilling to acknowledge Kashmir's alternative memories and alternative aspirations for the future. So, as mentioned earlier, the line of control is heavily militarized, with armies stationed on both sides, weapons and guns blazing. Firing and mortar shelling can start at any point. And this cross-border violence was at its peak during the 1990s. And this is a time when the Kashmiri liberation movement, when Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control were engaged in an armed struggle for freedom, or in the local language for Azadi, against the brutal Indian occupation. And for some 13 years, this entire sub-region was in the middle of active cross-border conflict. Thousands of civilians were killed, maimed, or injured. Infrastructure, livelihoods, and life projects destroyed or put on halt. And it was only in 2003 that a shaky ceasefire was reached, bringing some relief to the volatile region. But even now, fighting can erupt between the two militaries at any point in time. And this period of calm was short-lived. Just 2 years later, in 2005, a massive earthquake devastated these mountains, crisscrossing Kashmir and northern Pakistan, followed by widespread monsoon flooding in 2010. And together, the two environmental disasters disrupted the lives of some 25 million people throughout Pakistan and Kashmir, activating an era of intense humanitarian action. And then there have been recurring floods since then, because the region, is home to more glacial ice than anywhere else in the world, outside of the polar regions. So with rising temperatures, comes increasing floods. So while, a ceasefire is officially in place, like I said, skirmishes flare up unannounced at the line of control, bringing life to a standstill. And then communities must navigate, the uncertainties of the ongoing conflict, and their lives worsened by unpredictable environmental collapse. So along with other forms of diminishment, such as, deep-rooted structural poverty, lack of services and isolation, poor infrastructure, and so on. So, for the rural and pastoral Bahari people, violence is omnipresent. It's always life-shaping, constant, chipping away. Yet as the protagonists of this book demonstrate, and as one of my interlocutors often reminded me, life finds a way, right? So how can we think about violence when it is everywhere, or atmospheric, or as Christina Sharp puts it, forms the very weather? And how does life find its way despite the violence it bestows? And what does it mean to live within dystopia as dailiness? What is the social labor to which people refuse the conditions of death imposed upon them? These are some of the questions that animate the book. One of our interlocutors, he remarked that the air may be fresh air, but it's also very heavy. It is this heaviness that I'm interested in. And other people would often say to me, the atmosphere of the mountain is such as such. Or in Urdu, Yaka Mahali Asai. It is the very atmosphere that the book is attended to. That's important because the violence in the mountains, it's diffuse, yet palpable in nature, cannot be reduced to a single texture or tonality, such as bodily harm caused by cross-border shelling or the collapsing of one's home during an earthquake. The violence has a lingering intensity and immense ethereal concentration. So then, what clues can attention to the atmosphere provide about life's intensity in a world on decline? This video is taken by a young man on his cell phone, and he's struggling to contain the scope of the flooding within the frames of his phone. You will see him zoom in and out. And in a sense, that's what disasters are, uncontainable, that which exceeds the frame. So my initial impulse, was to document experiences of earthquakes and floods, but people spoke very little about these spectacular events. I also did not insist. Instead, our conversations revolved mostly around, rather ordinary experiences, such as those of the betrayal of a close friend, the fear and hold of the military, or just the sheer boredom of being young and lonely in the mountains. And within these, unassuming details, they're rather breathtaking clues on how people grapple with the afterlife of disasters, how they sustain themselves by nourishment, breath, and breathing. So I became interested in the affective and its minutiae, the slippage of relations, the withering of friendships, the slides, the grudges, life's growing pains, to come to grips with the multiple forms of violence that foregrounds life in these mountains, not just the earthquake or the floods. And I came to understand that while these disasters were substantial events, they did not encapsulate the entirety of people's experiences, nor represented the full range of the violence at play. They were just another blow in a long durée of violations, diminishment, and dehumanization. Catherine Youssef writes, the Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialism have been ending worlds for as long as they've been in existence. So I found in my work that disasters are rarely, definitive ruptures of some coherent life world, but perhaps part and parcel of the ongoing labor of making life viable. And I have come to understand disasters as cascading forms of violence. They're part of ongoing chronicity where large and small events fold into each other. So I'm interested in how chronicity unfolds in everyday life, is particularly situated, localized, contextual, and how people make incremental or radical adjustments in relation to each other and their social worlds. And then to answer these questions, I got interested in the idea of flourishing. Lauren Berlant asked, why are there only so few words for flourishing? In a crisis culture, we're so excited about gaming the difference between 0 and 1 that flourishing somehow gets bracketed. And survival looks like a triumph, and that's a terrible thing. I understand flourishing as, the ethical and moral risks people take in their daily lives that carry some kind of political and existential stakes, and which offer clues on desirous futures and wanting pasts and presents. So flourishing refers to, a certain sense of aliveness, which Kevin Quashie argues cannot be mapped in the syntax of Western norms. And to bring this discussion closer to the mountains, I look at flourishing and survival within the more familiar heuristic of maza, which in the Urdu word, which refers to the verve and joy of a life ontologically well lived. So maza in Urdu means pleasure or joy. Jonathan Anjaria and Olga Anjaria describe maza as sensuous, which draws us to life's viscerality and exerts an embodied pull on us. So really, the main task of the book is to search for life, more life, and to expand the repertoire of life itself. What Rana Kabadia says makes sense with what has been ghosted. And to do this work, the book is organized in a number of scenes. A scene is basically an affective swirl, a blending of theoretical and ethnographic textures, or they can be thought of as a framing device to which specific aspects of the feeling world are rendered palpable. And each scene is dedicated to a single interlocutor. And together, they kind of force us to hold extraordinary violence and ordinary concerns in the same breath. But sensation in these mountains is in excess. It is too much to handle. And textual representation alone cannot do justice. And you will see that the book is visually very rich. Many of these images were taken by my interlocutors themselves, and they've been credited so. Tina Camp asked, what does it mean to listen to images? And she suggests that listening to images means opening oneself to the many ways images and photos make contact. After all, photographs are also haptic objects, meaning that they can also be touched. In the olden days, when we still had photo albums, we would touch photographs, pass them around, put them in a frame. And the encounter, Tina Camp argues, can also be sonic. Sonic images register at a quiet frequency that is not the silent. And she says photographs have the potential to kind of softly convey the buzzing tensions of colonialism, the low hums of resistance and subversion. Coming to the scenes, the first scene is dedicated to Niaz. Niaz is permanently paralyzed as a result of an injury. He's paraplegic. But Niaz does not attribute his most profound dysphoria to either the accident which led to his injury or the earthquake which destroyed his village, but the disloyalty of his best friend. And he helps us understand disasters as forms of betrayal, which can catalyze conditions for letting each other down. Think of the earlier video of the flooding. Disasters are what is in the frame as well as what is outside of it. And he compels us to consider, is the disaster a betrayal or is the betrayal a disaster? And what constitutes a disastrous event and who gets to name it? We have Rubina, who volunteers as a midwife in the memory of her deceased husband. And she brings to the fore how people acknowledge and maintain regard for one another through the smallest acts of kindness and the minutest of gestures, such as making someone laugh with their unbearable pain or offering a cold glass of water to a woman in childbirth. And she helps us to think about moral presence and how mundane practices of kindness and care can create the background conditions needed for broader social and political change. We have Satar, and Satar calibrates his investments or reliance on others as being subservient to his relationship with God. And he's arrived at the conclusion that only God has stood by him through the various trials and tribulations of life. And central to his reciprocity to God is the rejection of everyone else and all that is worldly. So how can we understand social repair for someone who exceeds the social? And I find that Satar's intense relationship with the divine is in fact cumulative and accretive of the very social he seeks to reject. So in this way, the rejection of the social or engaging with it on one's own terms constitutes a side of the social in itself, one that is needed for Satar's sustenance. We have Abrar. Abrar is a young man who's desirous of a world that is not permitted to have. For Abrar, things seldom go as planned. Even simple things, such as getting an important letter delivered on time, or getting your name spelled correctly on your high school diploma. And Abrar, compels us to think about all those ugly feelings, the frustration, the anger, the annoyance, at a life that constantly derails. And he helps us see that ugly feelings can lead to their own social formations and ways of relating, rendering any kind of singular or fixed sovereignty non-operational. and that these ugly feelings can be perhaps generative and ontologically informed. Finally, we have Chandni Bibi, who insists that the earthquake made her blind, despite her family insisting that her vision was impaired ever since she was a child. So with the earthquake, forever coded in her blindness, she ensures that the earthquake is not reduced to an event that can be simply resolved and recovered from. And if we truly consider her blindness as social commentary and critique, we begin to appreciate the multiple ways disasters are lived, embodied, and surpassed. And she makes me think about what Edward Gulsan calls the right to opacity, that the unknowability of our interlocutors must be protected to limit the overtures of imperial knowledge production, which mistakenly assumes that difference can be resolved if only understood. This was just to give you, a sense of the range of people who breathe life into the book. And the scene demonstrated, people's expectations from life that perhaps no one else can satisfy, a kind of sovereignty in the making or a fractured sovereignty. And in this web of expectations, nothing is final or stable. There's always something that is yet to come, an element of wonder. And put together, the scenes show, what it means to consider aliveness in ways that are not indexed to death. How can the question of life and all this incessant living and dying be posed as a question of the social? And what more can be said about those subtle arts of repair by which rich and robust lives are sustained through the weight of centrifugal odds? Okay. I'm just going to close off in a bit, but I want to leave you with a few pressing questions, which I think are important. First, I want to go back to the question of, why do we write, research, and produce scholarship? What does it mean to write about people, communities, place, which are subjugated to enormous forms of violence, where the stakes are much higher than building disciplines and disciplinary knowledge? This knowledge only mattered when it fills gaps in the literature, when no subject lives their lives along disciplinary lines. This knowledge only mattered when it appears as peer-reviewed articles and monographs, such as the one I wrote. Higuru Macharya knows that so much knowledge exists as songs and dances, as gossip and rumor, as barely understandable markings on trees and stone floors, as disturbed earth and invasive plants. Yet we keep on insisting knowledge is only credible as peer-reviewed articles and monographs. Disciplines are not designed to honor our obligations to the places we inhabit or the people we meet. Catherine McKettrick warns us, discipline is empire. Disciplinary power works in tandem with biopower. The roots of disciplinary knowledge lie in the very same mechanisms of control of the prison, the factory, the slave ship, and the plantation. And colonial disciplines for extraction give way to colonial disciplines of extraction. And I think the very same imagination that goes into the formation of the nation state informs the production of disciplines. So nation states don't disappear from our analysis and future imaginations because disciplines don't. So then if you ask me, what is the alternative to discipline? I think the alternative is accountability. And then who are we accountable to in our work? The discipline, the profession, the institution, our relations? And what if they collide as they often do? And who sets the standards and holds us to them when institutionalized accountability is too self-interested or too self-absorbed or insufficient, even absent? And are the contributions of the university to colonize peoples and places overstated and oversold? Mohammed Junaid and Hafsa Kantrul ask, what is an anti-occupation pedagogic practice that is seeking to trace the arc of solidarity from the West to Kashmir look like for academics situated in the Western Academy? The knowledge production continues to remain in many ways tied to imperialism and colonial violence. And then who's allowed to shift that border? The Circle's Conspiracy of Writers is an anti-colonial collective that writes about borders. And they recall the story of a Belgian farmer who accidentally shifted the French border to drive his tractor across farmlands between the two countries. But nothing happens to the farmer. He's a white European man. No one feels threatened. And the transgression is dismissed as an amusing story. But they ask, what happens when brown, queer, feminist, and decolonial movements try to shift lines and borders? The discipline, too, I think, is the colonial border. It's important to note who is allowed to rework that border. And what is your theory of change? Eve Tuck contends that the default theory of change in sexual, colonial, or racial capitalism is that if you document the damage, get enough people to pay attention, then together our voices will somehow convince whoever's in charge to give up their power and resources, right? There's an over-investment in empathy and emotion that leads to change in the innocence of the powerful without actually disturbing the centers of power. And then, are you doing the work? Audre Lorde routinely asked, are you doing your work? She's referring to the introspection and deeper conversations that need to be had. And what is the work? Sometimes we're so sure of what the work is that we forget to ask, what is the work? If you ask me that question, as someone who writes on Kashmir but is not Kashmiri, I've not understood my work as that of defining Azadi or defining freedom, or providing, expert commentary or imposing concepts on a life already constrained. My task, as I understand it, is rather modest. It's to enlarge and expand the frames of legibility on Kashmir, to stress the relation between possibility and desire, and to prod and poke the realisms of imperial maps, borders, and boundaries. And what is the work? Is the institution the place to do this work? I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
We want to change the light setting, please. Thank you so much, Omar. Intense. The book is intense, is all I will say. And I think one last comment that I will also make is that it needs a lot of sitting with the book to really digest the complexity that it is trying to convey. On that note, let's open it up for Q&A. Any hands? Alec and Nat.
You were talking quite a bit about sort of alternative models of knowledge. And I think when you were talking about your grouping, you discussed briefly on effective swirls. And I was just wondering what you meant by that and how it, what it implied for how we group knowledge.
Right.
To take
two.
Yeah. Nat?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for that, Omer. That was really, really fascinating, really wonderful, really thought-provoking. Yeah, I read the book and brilliant. I guess my question kind of pertains to how you situate the work within the increasing claims that intellectual kind of work can decolonize and kind of liberate and have some kind of emancipatory potential. And then thinking about how commonplace at the same time is the claim at the same time that modes of incorporation and co-optation kind of exist to capture kind of radical alterity and kind of re-enfold it back into dominant epistemologies, whether we kind of define those as kind of westernized in quotation marks or not. So this could be about kind of positionality statements that are actually very individuating and follow a kind of sovereign individualism and thus re-enfold us back into a neoliberal frame. Or it could be kind of falling back, as Rubina was talking about, to kind of categorical and kind of foundational ways of thinking, subject-object, sacred vein, global south / north. And I was just thinking about, and I was thinking about this particularly in relation to how you've invoked repair. And I I was wondering if it is repair. I guess two questions. So like, what form does repair take in your work? And then the second was, is it repair that offers some kind of rupture to these dominant epistemological frames? And yeah, so I would like to hear much more about repair within that kind of context.
Yeah, okay, well, tough questions. So the first question about what is an affective swirl and what is the intent of the scene in terms of consolidating some kind of knowledge. So the idea of the scene is really to kind of pull us into an affective relation with our interlocutors, right? It's not really meant to be a site of containment, but it's meant to be like an incision into someone's life through a certain kind of affect that became very prominent in my encounter with that individual. So for example, one scene is dedicated to this notion of betrayal. Another scene is dedicated to this notion of kindness. Another scene is dedicated to this notion of, ugly feelings or these frustrations of life. So that becomes kind of a heuristic device to kind of consolidate a certain kind of relation the individual has with the world, and also how I entered in relation with them in that particular encounter, right? It's just an offering. It's just a way to cut into someone's life without kind of claiming finality over that life. It's just a glimpse, a little sliver, little offering essentially. Okay? In terms of co-option, I think it's a failed project. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not saying this is a decolonized book. I think it's an attempt to do something. It's definitely a failed project, because how can it decolonize this space and the institutions and the departments and the disciplines that we're so ingratiated in and situated in, right? It's a failed project. That's my starting point, right? In terms of repair, I think repair for me is just a container to kind of capture and contain these excessive and exuberant experiences in relation to people's efforts and attempts at making life possible in a space of such diminishment and erasure. It's a container to kind of capture, the life ontologically well lived, the pleasures of life, the downfalls of life, the pitfalls of life, and that's it. It's not a grand theoretical project. I don't want to, replace one category with another, because that again defeats the purpose, right? Yeah.
Any more questions? Jagran?
Yeah, I haven't read your book, but I really want to read it now. But from your presentation, what you talked about, it seems like you were kind of like trying to capture like the experiential quality of Kashmir, rather than trying to obviously categorize it as academic language. So it seems to me that like there's a lot of like poetic language, religious language, that type of approach to it instead. So my question is it that Kashmir kind of forced you to talk about it that way, or did you feel that was the best way in which to discuss that experience?
Any other questions? Two questions.
So there's this growing talk of shifting the power from in the development world of north to south, or kind of decolonizing it. But do you think this is obviously talked by the people in the West and the North? Are you like, do you think that they're actually taking the same approach as people who are colonizing were actually taking, because they're kind of trying to imply their own positionality and their own ideas whilst trying to shift the power?
Right.
So are they actually listening to the voices, or do these people actually who have been colonized before, do they want to decolonize, or is that being considered as well?
Right. So I think a bit of both, right? I think Kashmir did force me to be very humble, to be honest. Realizing that none of my theoretical training or my whatever degrees I have were purposeful in that space. That I needed new tools and language and ways of looking at the world, which could honestly and sincerely engage with the lives of people living there. So it was, a really steep learning curve and an exercise of humility, right? So I think it did, yeah. I think people forced me to kind of abandon my inheritance, my knowledge inheritance, kind of abandon my frames of reference. Kind of a free fall. It was very scary. But I think it was a compelling journey, because I think helped me write in ways that I wouldn't have been able to write otherwise, right? If it wasn't for that embodiment and experience, right? I also think this is a much better way of writing about anybody or any kind of context of coloniality, because we keep on writing the same books, we keep on writing the same, repeating the same frames of reference. There's a huge body of literature on Kashmir, but it's all from security studies. It's all about like peace and conflict in very predictable ways that kind of enforce the role of the nation state, that enforces these mega concepts and theories and tensions, which I think was not needed in these conversations that I had with people that I read. So I think a bit of both. In terms of shifting the power, I mean, it's another space of co-option, right? How do aid organizations and development organizations remain legible within this fast changing environment where people are demanding decolonization, people are demanding the transfer of power, and more engaged placements within these institutions. I think some of it is co-option, like you're saying. Some of it might be sincere, depending on the organization and the kind of internal politics that they embody. I think it's a bit of both. Most likely.
Questions? If people don't have, I have a question. Oh, yes, Macy, go ahead.
A lot of the book, like in the book, you talk a lot about like the heart and like the work of the heart, and it's all about affect. And for me, like what stood out most was this, this like understanding of knowledge. There's a whole bit about like the gift of knowledge and how that can transcend kind of transactionality of it. How do you bring kind of that richness and all of that knowledge into these kind of institutionalized spaces where like I can remember the first time I read this book was with you kind of like outside of a university space. Like, how do you see this? Like, can it be contorted to fit into these kind of marketized, militarized spaces that are these institutions? Like, so it's a good question, like, what are your thoughts about that?
I feel like that deserves a question with an answer right away.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So we first read the book together in the encampment, student encampment. That's where I did my first book launch. And that was a very different experience and a different mode of receiving and engaging with knowledge compared to in the classroom, the many other book talks I've given in universities. So hard work is, the central methodological kind of reference in the book. And the idea is that you also need to work on yourself before you're worth your receiving knowledge. That the internal conversations and contradictions that you need to look into, not address them, but look into, acknowledge them before you can sincerely and genuinely engage with this work of knowledge and knowledge production and work with solidarity and allyship and accountability with peoples who are like already in spaces of oppression and so forth, right? So for me, that was like an individual's style of attunement. It's kind of recapture what knowledge is, how to even engage with knowledge production. The whole idea is that we should be shifting and pushing back against these institutional frames. The whole book is written with the intention of creating space for that kind of conversation in these classrooms. It's only my hope that we can do that. But I think, as you know, the challenge is quite huge. Let's see if the book is able to do its work in these spaces or not. I don't know.
Any more questions? I have a question. It's, the material that you write and the way you write is not everybody's cup of tea. Yeah. I was just wondering about the life of the book in terms of the pushback that you might have had from publishers and institutions that are used to reading knowledge in a certain way. So I just wanted you to, respond to that. Think of questions.
Okay, sorry. Can I respond?
Yeah.
I mean, a whole lot of rejection, right? A whole lot of publishers turning down because they weren't happy that the book doesn't fit a certain frame or a certain knowledge tradition. Anthropology, even though anthropologists think they're already decolonized, they're not.
No.
They have huge, forms of gatekeeping and control that prevents and only legitimizes certain kind of knowledge as anthropology and delegitimizes all other as being non-anthropology, right? So negotiating those fixtures within the university space, within academic spaces, within publishers, that's this old thing, right? But then also, I found that, the pushback I received was never about the intellectual merits of the book. It was more about the form, the intention, and what is the larger piece that you're working towards, what knowledge are you contributing to. It was never about that this book is intellectually deficient or it isn't worthy of being published, right? So that kind of gave me clues about what is pissing people off. It wasn't the substance of the book. It was how I was engaging in people's lives, how I was kind of bringing it in relation to what we think is the academic profession. Those were the things that were annoying people the most, right? So that actually kind of invigorated my desire to push for the book. So it's been a bit of a process. It took a long while to get out, more than 5 years to come out, because it was circulating in this meta universe where I couldn't find the right home and the right reader for it to be welcomed into the academic publishing industry, right? And then I get pushback at every place I go, every conference I attend, every paper I present, all this pushback. So I'm like, it's second nature now, I think, with this book.
Gibran?
Yeah, just mine's a really simple question. Why Kashmir?
Pardon, why Kashmir?
Yeah, just-
Yeah, it's not a simple question, actually.
Put it to
But
words.
it's a stabilizing question. Yeah. Well, I'm Pakistani, so I grew up in Pakistan. So Pakistanis have this weird relationship with Kashmir because they're one of the colonial powers in their region. So Kashmir is something that is always in your face, kind of. So there's that, my colonial legacy in relation to Kashmir. I also was a humanitarian worker before I came to this academic space, and I did work in the region as an aid worker. I think those two kind of consolidated my interest in Kashmir. I don't have a better answer. Yeah.
Hi, really interesting by the way. So I've got two questions. One was just a clarification one. You spoke a lot about disciplines. I was wondering what it maybe is the relationship between discipline and responsibility. You spoke about discipline and accountability, and I was wondering if responsibility came into that. And also you spoke how India is a hegemonic place of knowledge in the region. What do you think can be done? Do you think Pakistan should be viewed in the same light? Do you think it should stay in this region of knowledge? Do you think what should be done about that?
Okay.
Any other questions?
What was the first question?
The responsibility, accountability.
Responsibility account.
So I'm kind of in the book, I kind of trace the origins of what an academic discipline is. And I kind of argue that the same sensibilities and relationships and discourses that inform the necessity to create disciplines is the same that went into demanding discipline in the factory, on the slave ship, on the plantation, and so forth. To kind of make this almost metaphorical, but also this linkage between discipline of extraction and disciplines of knowledge production. They kind of argue that disciplines by default are also sites of extraction, the same way we extract labor out of people or slaves and so forth. Right? That's where that language comes in, right? And can we be accountable through disciplines? I don't know. I think that's something we all struggle with in our work. People who write in disciplinary forms. I don't think it's a natural place to be accountable, to express that accountability. In terms of South Asia as being an inhospitable place for other spaces other than India, I think South Asian studies came at a time after the Cold War and all of those times when there was a kind of a consolidation of regions in very unhealthy and problematic ways. So South Asian studies right now, I think, is dominated by mostly Indian-centric knowledge at the expense of not just Pakistan, but Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and all these other spaces. Maldives also have a stake in knowledge production on the region, right? So my desire is, either you fight back that and kind of open up the frames, or you reject it entirely. And you look somewhere else for inspiration, look somewhere else for that kind of community. And I've taken the second route in the book. I've said that I don't want to engage with South Asia as a carceral device, as a device of containment. What if I form a relationship with knowledge coming out of North America, such as Black scholarship, urban Black studies, and indigenous studies, which has its own history of refusal and resistance to colonization. That's the leap I've taken in the book.
The term Azadi kept coming up. how sort of central would you say that is to Kashmiri culture?
Oh, it's the heartbeat of the culture. It's the pulse of the region. Azadi is freedom, right?
How would you reckon? Maybe a better question would be like, how do the Kashmiris talk about it? Like, how does that take part in their language, or how they talk to each other and everything?
So in various ways, right? Azadi means a lot of different things for different people. There's no consensus on Azadi, I think. People define freedom in so many different situated ways. For some, it is this very simple notion of a sovereign land that is distinct and disconnected from India and Pakistan. For others, it's more about other forms of, let's say, greater rights in existing political situation. For some, it's about having different kinds of influence on sociality or on intellectual knowledge production, right? So I think you won't find a single understanding of Azadi in that book, but you will find a dispersed, multiple reading or engagement with that. Also, it's not our job to define Azadi for people either, right? Should come from the people who are fighting that fight. My job really, I think, in the book was to kind of open that conversation up and kind of reduce that language of containment so there are more options and more texture to that conversation itself, right? And then for the reader, the Azadi is to like reject disciplines, to kind of push back on our institutions, to develop the courage and freedom to write in ways that are not subservient to academic knowledge standards and much.
My question is about your positionality. Did you feel like when you were doing the actual fieldwork, the interviews, do you feel like you were welcome? Do you feel like an outsider? Or, I mean, because Azad Kashmir and you're Pakistani, people treat you a certain way.
Right. So yeah, I was definitely an outsider, not an insider, very much rejected for many years before a reasonable relationship could be formed. And I think it took a while to gain trust. It's still a process. It's not a given. I think the best thing I've learned is consistency, that you need to show up all the time. But by showing up, I just don't mean arriving there, but show up in people's lives when they need you, for example. Establishing relationships even when you're not there. So my interlocutors are in touch with you now through WhatsApp. They call me when I'm in Pakistan. They try to come to my home. And in the book, I talk about this very strange experience when I go from being, just an outsider to a spectacle, like kind of where people will laugh at me because I don't know how to navigate the mountains. I'm so clumsy. I would get exhausted and tired from climbing a slope or even going from one point to the other point, right? So very quickly, and children would actually bet on me whether I would take 10 minutes together or 40 minutes, and how many balls of water will I have to be this time?
Called Omer and Ajuba.
Yeah, the kind of how do you say Ajuba in English?
I don't know. How would you translate Ajuba?
Like a
Somebody who's like a space cat, like somebody who's like a complete outsider, like somebody who's a little, yes, an alien, like
literally an alien.
Yeah,
right? And that's the language of use, right?
A spectacle.
Yeah, spectacle.
Spectacle.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's the language people use for they still probably use it.
Macy has a question.
You wrote about the shoe that hit you in the face,
Right.
and the shoe that hit Bush in the face. And I like the book ends like I was rereading the book today, and the book ends with the shoe. Can you talk a bit more about the shoe and how that kind of experience then weaved into your field work and the ethnography itself and into writing and
Right.
your life in general?
So, the book opens up with this intervention where I talk about, I recall the incident when, an Iraqi journalist threw a shoe at President George Bush during the war. The shoe was placed in a museum. There were calls to place it in a museum of rights and so forth. It was rejected. And that kind of juxtaposed that with my experience as an aid worker when I'm sitting in a community hall being taken to task for a shoddy job that I've done. And community members throw a shoe at me. And that reminded me of the time when President Bush was throwing a shoe at me. And I stick with that. And the idea is you sit with that dislocation in the book. Then I end the book with kind of a poetic intervention, which I would read if I had it. I could read it. It's very short. So I closed the book by saying, let's try this again. Who are you as a scholar? What is your location? It varies. Some days I'm a feminist, some days I'm queer, some days I'm a storyteller, some days I'm an agitator, some days I'm an ally, some days I'm a poser, some days an appropriator, some days I'm a contrarian, some days I just stay in bed all day long. Let's try this again. Who are you as a scholar? What is your location? Today I cannot decide. Let's try this again. Who are you as a scholar? What is your location? Must you ask this question? Let's try this again. Who are you as a scholar? What is your location? I think a lot about the shoe. Right? So the idea is that you sit with discomfort, you sit with the inability to resolve tension, and you sit with that instead of trying to resolve it. And that becomes another kind of guiding force for you when you do this kind of work or research or practice or whatever you do.
Any questions, comments?
Or any online questions?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes, completely forgot. Any online questions? Bad chair. Yeah. So I think we should, on that note, we will call this a close. And thank you, Omer.